Can U.S. democracy foster the common good? Over the past year, I've hosted a couple of book discussions many of you have been to, and they've all discussed the demise of democracy. This coming tomorrow night, in fact, we're discussing Levitsky and Ziblatt's How Democracies Die. It echoes some of the themes of two other books that we've read and discussed on Tyranny by Timothy Snyder and The Common Good by Robert Reich. And they all indicate that we are drifting on a sea of social unrest and anger and fear further away from the ideals that anchor our ship of state. So now we risk crashing into the rock of reactionary authoritarianism or drifting out to the seas of civil war. Now, as a student of history, I appreciate how easy it is to drift into catastrophe because leading up to the Civil War in this country, very few people anticipated the years of bloodshed that was going to occur. It's very easy to look at history and think that it had to be that way. But it actually was not very anticipated. It might have been different. But we were caught in this accelerating cycle over political, economic, and cultural differences. And as a nation, we were not thinking clearly. And I feel like as a nation right now, we are not thinking clearly. So it got me thinking. We had this catastrophe over a century and a half ago where you had 3 million soldiers enlisted to fight, leading to 600,000 dead. In a single day at Antietam, 22,000 casualties were occurred in a single day. Now, many believe that such a civil war can't occur today. They think we're a very different society. We're not going to have these battlefield conflicts. But there's so much desperation and poverty and addiction and fear in this country that there is a push towards violence. We have polarization that's increasing extremism and hostility. How many armed and disturbed Dylan Roofs are going to find a new place of worship to walk in and kill people? Or how many people are going to drive into protest with their car and kill somebody like happened in Charlottesville? Or how many people are going to beat up somebody that they claim they were afraid of, even though he was 15 against 1, in a garage, as did Jacob Scott Goodwin, who was just found guilty this week of malicious wounding. Most Americans did not see the Civil War coming, and today, Charlottesville surprised people. Gregory Downs, a historian, said that we take our stability for granted. And I think that's true sometimes. The governor of Virginia, Terry McAuliffe, in responding to the violence in Charlottesville last summer, asked near incredulously, how did we get to this place? The Southern Poverty Law Center, tracking a historic rise of hate groups in this country. Robin Wright, who was a writer for the New Yorker, said, how fragile is the Union, our republic, and a country that has long been considered the world's most stable democracy? The dangers are now bigger than the collective episodes of violence. Along with others, Wright worries that a new civil war could occur and that it would be, as Wright describes it, low-intensity conflicts with episodic violence but in constantly moving locales. So more and more of these flashes of violence leading to deaths and more anger. A career military expert, Keith Mines, who studies civil wars in other countries, came up with 5 characteristics that, if they're existing, there's a greater chance for civil war. Listen to these characteristics and think about our country today. Okay? Entrenched national polarization, divisive press coverage, weakened institutions like Congress and the judiciary, abandonment of responsibility by political leadership, and the legitimization of violence. There's a map circulating on the internet now that's kind of very popular. It shows red-leaning voting districts in Republican-leaning voting districts in red and Democratic-leaning voting districts in blue. And superimposed over this map is an outline of the Confederacy. How many have seen that? And one of the things that's striking is that the inside the outline, it's very red. Very red. Now, Judith Ginsburg, who is the author of Journal of the Civil War and a historian at Villanova University, after viewing the map said, well, not much has changed. Now, a finer grained map will show you that there are more complexities and we have to be a little more nuanced because within each of the voting districts you have other divisions in the country within the South Things like urban and rural divisions, or divisions based on economics, or on class differences, or educational differences. So it's more complicated than that, but there's a lot of truth to Ginsburg's conclusion when she said, it's a lot like 1859, everyone is mad at something and everyone has a gun. So I'm going to take a closer historical look at the divisions that were wrapped up in the Civil War, and I think that when we appreciate the depth of those divisions between the North and the South, we can better appreciate the divisions that exist today. I think those divisions are what keeping us from building the common good. Now, there are some people that actually trace the division between the blue and the gray back millenniums. There have been George Fitzhugh, who was a very famous pro-slavery advocate in the South in the 19th century, would go back to ancient Greece and show that, well, see, here's a slave-holding culture that created civilization. Of course, it was on the backs of their slaves, but he was justifying it, claiming that the nobles of Athens were uplifting the slaves who were lucky to work for them, these barbarians. Okay? Which I will add was a status one level up of chattel slavery in the United States. That's another talk. But many Confederate apologists go back to feudal Europe to describe their southern aristocracy. You have large mansions, you have sprawling estates, you have dueling, fox hunting. There was a belief by the Southern noblemen that they were an honorable leaders of a social structure that should be replicated around the world. They embraced what was known as cavalier culture, where horsemanship and breeding were seen as signs of superiority. And in fact, in the South, there was such a cultural affinity for all things aristocratic that the books of Sir Walter Scott, which talked about the aristocracy, became a craze in the antebellum South. This rubbed many Northerners the wrong way, who were descendants of Puritans and fled aristocratic England to get away from this very type of aristocracy. And somewhat tongue-in-cheek, Mark Twain actually blamed the Civil War on the South's love of aristocracy, or as he called it, the Sir Walter disease. Northerners embraced the Puritan work ethic and industry and frugality and piety, and they condemned the luxury, the extravagance, and the dissipation of the South. That's how they described it. Noah Webster, spokesman for Northern superiority, said, "O New England, how superior are thy inhabitants in morals, literature, civility, and industry." Southerners, in turn, hated, quote, "the Saxonized mallworms creeping from the Mayflower. No match for the whole-souled Norman British planters of a gallant race." Francis Louis Philippe warned that the cultural divide between the Puritan North and the Cavalier South meant that America, quote, "had conflicting interests, ambitions, and unappeasable jealousies." So tracing it back centuries and generations upon generations, there was a radically different sense of identity in the North and the South, not just history, but David Blight, a Yale historian, said it's not just racial polarization over the slave issue. He called it a seizure about identity. So the New York Times writer Manisha Sinha said that in 1850, like today, those on both sides of the culture war, quote, "seem to inhabit different universes with fundamentally opposed values, mores, and tastes." So there wasn't a single community in this country of shared identities or shared values. It was like we were two foreign nations before the first shot of the war ever occurred. And that explains, to a big degree, the intensity and the duration of the Civil War, which I want to impress upon you, nobody anticipated. The systematic violence of the slave system makes it a little odd to think that people were shocked that there was violence, because there was violence well before the war in the system. But most Southerners either effectively framed slavery within that aristocratic myth or lived with self-deception, and most Northerners, frankly, were too removed from slavery to care, or they were too wrapped up in profits because the cotton industry fed the northern mills, and lots of agricultural products fed northern workers. So this was a national system. But when Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin became a bestseller, it inflamed the passions of many Northerners when they saw the horror at the heart of our country. And it so inflamed people that there's a possibly apocryphal story of Abraham Lincoln who went up to Harriet Beecher Stowe and supposedly said, "So you are the little woman who wrote the book that started this war." He meant that as a compliment, by the way. Cultural hatreds led to numerous physical altercations on the floors of Congress. Dozens of them, by the way. The most famous was when Preston Brooks, a congressman from the South, beat his cousin, Senator Sumner, because Sumner had made a speech on the floor of the Senate criticizing Southerners for having read too many books on chivalry, so that they believed themselves chivalrous knights with sentiments of honor and courage, rather than representatives of a corrupt system. So Brooks judged actually that his cousin was so not a gentleman that he didn't even deserve to be offered a duel. So instead he said, "I will beat him like a dog." And he did so with his cane, as Southerners gathered around and allowed the beating to continue, to the point that Sumner had to be hospitalized for months and never fully recovered. Pre-war violence exploded in the Midwest, where there was hot competition for land between slave owners and free whites. Bleeding Kansas, as it was known, saw brutal guerrilla warfare and cross-border raids and murder and arrests of entire opposing legislations. There were two legislative bodies, and they arrested each other. It led to the most famous of all butcheries in John Brown's raid on Pottawatomie Creek, with his broadsword-bearing posses that made the paper and created more intensity. And John Brown felt like God justified that violence. And that was a part of the deep hatred, and you can see that echoing today, this sense of righteousness. Southerners thought that they were defending God's natural hierarchy and virtue and Southern purity, the purity of the Southern women. Virginia Tech's Paul Quigley claims that the religious dimension of the Confederacy, in fact, increased the savagery of the fighting because they saw themselves as the chosen people. And so even their own defeats they took to prove that God was trying to test their faith. So that's why they fought for so long in such a bloody war. They saw themselves as martyrs, so they created saints out of their generals, which is one reason why Southern statues of the Confederacy mean so much to some certain people. They were literally created as saints. Southern General Sterling Price called on rebels to, quote, to repel the, quote, Federals polluting Missouri soil, winning their glorious inheritance from the oppressors and invaders who have desecrated their homes. Northerners, same way, thought themselves as godly in their work. They marched to the Battle Hill of the Republic. Julia Ward Howe's famous words, "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed his faithful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on." They marched to that and they believed it in good stead, that they were God's workers in this war. So the war continued. Both sides continued to dehumanize each other because it's easier to kill somebody when you dehumanize them. Yanks saw the dirty Rebs as uneducated hicks and traitors with little inherent worth. The Confederates called the Yankees, quote, liars, cheats, cowards, mammon-worshipping fiends. See any echoes today in those claims? Southern diarist Mary Chestnut wrote of the despised Yankees, who she described were like red ants, like locusts and frogs, which were the plagues of Egypt. Now, when I grew up, the Civil War was portrayed as a glorious battle, a victory of good over evil. And only in college did I really begin to learn of the terrorism that was involved in this war. Like Champ Ferguson, who was a Southern soldier, who would cut off the heads of elderly people and roll the heads into the towns that he was besieging before he entered. There were things like the rapes and the murders that were commonplace in Sherman's March to the Sea. I mean, Sherman was the man who said war is hell. And he made sure it was. And there were both sides had barbaric prisoner of war camps. In the South, at Andersonville, Georgia, Camp Sumter, Camp Douglas in the North, you look at photos and it looks like the concentration camps liberated after World War II with emancipated soldiers who died by the dozens hourly in both camps. Now, I used Ken Burns' 1990 documentary, The Civil War, when I was teaching to high school students to bring this brutality to the surface, like the pictures of Matthew Brady with the piles of corpses and the bloody angle at Antietam. The interesting thing about Burns, though, is that he also included a bit of idealism. He talked a little bit about how the Civil War taught us many important lessons. Now, I see him as a master documentarian, brilliant. But he reminded me, for example, of Lincoln's genius on how Lincoln framed the war. From his call on the better angels of our nature before the war occurred, and his appeal for a healing spirit in the second inaugural address, one of the greatest speeches ever given as the war was winding down. And Lincoln admitted that before the war, neither party expected the magnitude or duration. And it surprised combatants who, he said, quote, both read the same Bible and prayed to the same God. And Lincoln's narrative of divine redemption claimed that the war had paid in blood for every drop of blood from a slave master's lash. He asked, with malice towards none, with charity towards all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in to bind up the nation's wounds. Now, critics of Burns' series said that he fell prey to a common human desire to make something ugly turn out all right, so that we've learned from it and we've moved on. It's hard to imagine that as much blood that was shed during the Civil War, that it was equal to the blood that was shed during 200 plus years of slavery, but we do want to see the Civil War as an end to an evil, as the beginning of a better day. And I think that romantic perspective about the Civil War actually marginalizes and harms people of color and other marginalized people who did not find themselves at the top of the heap after the war. Eric Foner, a brilliant historian, talked about how the sentiment behind this desire to color the Civil War in a good way obscured the deep problems of race and racism that endure to today. I mean, for anyone who knows how the Reconstruction period ended, it was the Compromise of 1877, when in exchange for getting a Republican president, the North pulled out of the South and handed back the South control of their states. And that led to the rise of Jim Crow and to the lynching period. So the violence was still there. That redemption came at a cost. And it was a cost paid primarily by people of color. Manisha Singh, in her article, Echoes of the Civil War, counsels that we would do well to pay heed to old enemies bubbling up in our politics. It is not that we are on the verge of another civil war, but that the Civil War never truly ended. Barbara Fields, a Columbia historian, was right, I think, when she said, I think what we need to remember most of all is that the Civil War is not over until we today have done our part in fighting it. She actually calls on William Faulkner's phrase when he said that history is not was, history is. Fields continues, she says, if some citizens live in houses and others live on the streets, the Civil War is still going on. It's still to be fought and regrettably can still be lost. So there's a lot I have to unpack in further talks there. But the question this sort of analysis of the Civil War gives me is, can we really heal? Are the wounds now so deep from 400 years of a system of oppression? Can we possibly foster the common good? So let me turn to the common good for a minute. What is it? Edmund Burke said, the common good is the general bank and capital of nations and of ages. It was a source of civic virtue for Burke. Robert Wright calls it more simply our shared values about what we owe each other as citizens. Is it really something that exists? Is it a lie? Is it true? How do we foster it while admitting that our nation was born out of slavery? That the common good was a privilege enjoyed only by some? The common good may have nurtured the better angels of our nature, but it was far from common. Through guile and ingenuity, we managed to keep the idea of the common good alive, but only by oppressing people of color, and women, and immigrants, and Native Americans. Jim Wallace, who wrote The Great Awakening, said that we need a new political language, a moral center that focuses on a genuine common good. It requires a deeper appreciation of equality before the law. And in trying to honor common good, I find that I'm really very deeply challenged, to the degree that I almost call it a spiritual challenge. I don't assume a God, so my faith is grounded in human beings, in our hopes, in our aspirations, in the institutions that we build, in the constitutions we write. And none of those are without this stain. Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black called for a constitutional faith. So how can I maintain that faith at a current time when it feels like the Civil War is still raging? I certainly put a lot of stock in our work here in Philadelphia with Power, which again calls on a spiritual faith, so that when I'm with my clergy colleagues and they are praying, I realize how much sustenance they're drawing from their theism, and I can't do that. And I know so much of religion, the ugly side of it, from the Inquisitions to the Crusades to the pseudo-religious racism and homophobia that today still hurts people. But I am drawn to an inclusive idealism that is in religion. John Winthrop, who in 1630, before his ship landed in New England, said, "We must delight in each other, make others' condition our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our community as members of the same body." This idealism is behind a public spiritualness that you can still find in pockets of New England, where you have local politics and barn raisings and quilting bees. Robert Wright appeals to faith leaders. He says faith leaders have to reject the growing selfish individualism and me-first mentality that's so on display in our national politics today. Wright finds inspiration, as I do, from Martin Luther King or John Lewis or Jim Lawson's commitment to the beloved community. And that's a religious concept for them, but it helps clarify my work as a secular leader. Resurrecting the common good as an ideal involves defending concepts of sacrifice or obligation or duty that may seem a little old-fashioned, especially in today's culture of consumer gratification, where you can order on demand or always get a better deal. But if we're to honor the common good, we have to find a way to sacrifice ourselves as individuals, to serve ourselves as members of a community. It's not about altruism. It's about a new concept of identity. James Madison said that to suppose any form of government will secure liberty or happiness without any virtue in the people is a chimerical idea. We can't have a good government without good people. And we can't be good people if we don't not only serve our individuality and autonomy, but the community we're a member of. Now, this idea of sacrificing yourself to the community, maybe it's easier at times when everybody is sacrificing. It was easy for FDR to sell this during the Depression because everybody was suffering. His fireside chats urged people to sacrifice for the good of all. He said, "We must move as a trained and loyal army, willing to sacrifice for the good of a common discipline." And people believed it. This same sentiment fueled modern progressivism that became a part of our movement of ethical humanism. The urban reform of Felix Adler or the social work of Jane Addams was not charity. It wasn't about handouts. Robert Reich says that this sort of work is a central obligation of American citizenship. It's about broadening our circle of concern. Reich says that moral choices logically involve duties to others, not just calculations about what's best for ourselves. To do that most effectively, we do have to start with children, which is one reason why Adler focused on children when he began this movement. It's one reason why we're moving forward with a new initiative next fall to expand our education efforts here, that you'll find out more about soon. But to make the common good real, we have to practice it. We have to help our children to practice it. De Tocqueville said we have to develop habits of the heart. Habits only develop when you regularly take up community responsibilities, from marching in a protest to helping bring the food for today's snack time. Our children are actually teaching us also about how these habits of the heart have to be more inclusive than they've ever been before. They can't exclude others because of their gender or their race or their orientation or their religion or their economic status. Edmund Burke, who's a hero to the conservatives, knew this. He wrote, "To be attached to that subdivision, to love the little platoon we belong in society, is the first principle of the germ, as it were, of public affections. It's the first link in the series by which we proceed towards a love of country and a love of humankind." At our best, the United States is about an all-encompassing faith. It has to go beyond the narrow parochialism that we always fall prey to, especially in divisive times. We can't just root for our team, whether that's our team due to partisanship or our team due to nationalism. Given the ideals that we preach but we so often don't practice, our patriotism can no longer be narrow. Our patriotism cannot be about America first. Reich says that in America, true patriots are deeply curious about and open to the rest of humanity. And that is a big job. The next generation are going to be the ones really having to carry this. My son Justin is just graduating from Hampshire College in a couple of weeks. And he's working right now part-time with the Ethics and the Common Good Project. This project tries to develop leaders that, quote, create a more equitable and resilient world. Resiliency we need more than anything because we're knocked down every day, every time you pick up the paper. Our dedication to equity has to be deep and wide. It can't just be about righting the political scales or getting back at the other party. But it has to be about empowering everybody. Ethics in the Common Good calls for a viable and a holistic alternative to current social, political, and economic systems based on the values of isolation, extraction, privatization, exploitation, inequity, and the accumulation of wealth, end quote. Because currently such isolation and exploitation and wealth are sowing discord and divide. In this divided society, we risk a profound tragedy of the commons, where precious shared resources and civic potential are wasted due to blindness and greed. Ethics in the Common Good emphasizes preserving the commons for current and future generations. I hope my words today link the past to the present to the future for you in some way. As a humanist, I have to look to this world for inspiration. I can't just look for today, this world for inspiration. I have to look back for lessons. I have to look forward for hope. Lincoln called on us connecting to the mystic chords of memory. By dedicating ourselves to a covenant that links past to the future, I think we stand the best chance for serving the common good. Each one of you here is going to have to decide where your role is. Every day you're trying to figure out what your role is in dealing with the common good. What part of you are you going to sacrifice? What part of your individuality are you going to put aside so you can become more of who you are as a member of communities? If we can do this, I think we will honor the worth of others and have the best chance of making the common good a reality.